Hello, and welcome to another installment of Criminology Chronicles. I'm Dr. Samantha Balemba, and I just wanted to pop in and talk about sort of an interesting thing that we were talking about in my homicide seminar class, and the students were really into it, and so I thought maybe this is a really good topic of conversation. And so we were talking about some of the patterns that we see between victims and offenders of homicide, and specifically gender patterns. And so, of course, as most of us probably know or would assume, most offenders are male. That is definitely true. But when we're looking at homicide patterns, most victims are also male. So there seems to be this misconception due primarily to the media and the sensationalism of certain, crimes, both in the news, but also in fictional accounts. But you see the dynamic of a male offender and a female victim within a homicidal encounter. While that is absolutely more likely to be the case when there is a sexual element, most homicide doesn't involve a sexual element. And so most homicides are male offenders and male victims. And so this is something that I sort of wanted to talk about, because then this brought up questions then about kind of what it looks like and the differences. And I mean, because there are female offenders and there are female victims, of course, but so looking at from the offender perspectives, one of the things that we kind of were talking about is whether the female criminality aspect is, it wouldn't be equal to the male criminality aspect, especially just violence in general, but homicide in particular. But maybe some of it at least is hidden. And I say that because we look at first of all, the victims that are chosen by these various different types of offenders. So male offenders tend to choose other males. They tend to choose somebody who is like similar in status to them. Typically it will be something like, a fight that escalates, or some kind of, challenge of masculinity, or felony murders or gang murders. This is sort of where the highest numbers of these things happen. And particularly with youthful offenders, young, anywhere from teenagers to mid-20s, sort of. This is what you see. You see gang violence, you see gun violence, you see it happening with, felony murders are far more likely. But when we look at homicide where the perpetrator is female, much more often women are going to kill their family members. So they kill their partner, they kill their children, and also, the types of violence that they use also differs. So women tend to use methods like poison and suffocation, and these sort of hands-off types of methods where they don't have to, do the dirty work, if you will. It's less. It's because men will use, guns. Men will use guns, but men will also. Even when we look at when there is a sexual component, then we're looking at things like strangulation, or, some other kind of just, physical beating, those types of things. That's what we see when men are the offenders. But when women are the offenders, that is very rare. Women won't tend to use, certainly not things like strangulation and, knives. That's just unlikely. It doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but it's far less likely compared to things like suffocation and poisoning and things like that. So we were kind of talking about whether women might be more violent than society would have us believe, and that just it is sort of hidden in a certain way. And so when we look at the tactics that women use, because they're not overtly aggressive, they're often, sometimes too, you have a situation where a woman will solicit a man to essentially do the work for her. And so then the man is the one that is actually doing the killing itself, but she is the one that orchestrated it. There are situations like that. A great example of that is Karla Homolka. She very much facilitated the murders that Paul Bernardo essentially went down for. And these are Canadian serial killers, but definitely look that case up if you don't know that one. But she was the orchestrator there. And then she also manipulated the court system where she got a much better deal than he did. And so she was out after 12 years, and he, as far as I know, is still in prison. So there are situations like that that happen as well. And also my students brought up the Gypsy Rose case as well as being an incidence of that. And so that kind of thing can happen. And then also, of course, the choice of methods that they use, that women use compared to men. So we got into this big conversation about whether women are actually either as violent as men, or at least comparable in terms of their likelihood of violence, or especially, of course, we're focusing specifically on homicidal violence. But if that is the case, then it is just more hidden. And I mean, there are theories that would kind of support this. And, one being what's called the chivalry hypothesis, which is that female criminality in general, not homicide, but all female criminality is hidden because society essentially wants to be chivalrous and we want to protect women. And so women are less likely to be arrested, women are less likely to be convicted. And when they are convicted, they typically receive shorter sentences when we compare it to men in similar situations. So it's an interesting question, and I would love to get your feedback if you'd like to comment or what have you. But I just thought it was something that we don't necessarily think about, because the assumption automatically goes to that, men are the offenders, and statistically that is overwhelmingly the case. But we can't sort of forget about this subset of female offenders, particularly when we're talking about homicide offenders. I mean, even when we look at the Tylenol murders that happened in Chicago like years ago, and they were the impetus for why we have the little safety caps on medications and stuff these days, because they didn't have that before. And I mean, when you look at something like that, at the time they had at least one suspect, partly because he confessed to it or whatever he called in, but then he recanted later. But now they're wondering if that was actually a female offender, and essentially that case is just random people were dying because cyanide was mixed in with Tylenol bottles, and so then people were dying from cyanide poisoning. So there's a theory out there now that, because they were never caught, but the theory is that could have been a female offender. So I'm wondering what you guys think, what anybody thinks who's watching this. It was a really fun conversation, and to the point where one of my students was like, man, we have stumbled across something that nobody else is talking about. What about this female criminality? And he's like, I'm so scared of women now. And I just wonder if this is actually a thing, if maybe it's just sort of a subset of a larger pattern, and certainly when we're seeing changing patterns. But yeah, just it was a fun conversation, so I thought I would talk about it a little bit. So let me know what you think, and definitely check out any of my other videos. Thanks.